Despite the middle period opus number, the Sonata in G minor, opus 49, number 1, was completed in 1798, but not published until 1805. This sonata is as close as we get to Beethoven pedagogy. Many of the elements of Beethoven's persona are present, but there are no advanced technical demands. The first movement of the piece is a perfect miniature sonata form, an ideal work to study before the more difficult sonatas. For this andante movement, as for most of Beethoven's slower music, we should set a presiding pace, not a strict metronomic tempo. The flowing and expressive tempo is created through the motion of the phrases rather than an unvarying beat or pulse. In this piece, we hear the beautiful Beethoven cantilena. Every note should have heartfelt expression without any trace of sentimentality or affectation. The ideal of legato was paramount for Beethoven. To make Beethoven's cantilena expressive and beautiful, we must use the pedal, changing constantly with every eighth note if necessary, and using incremental levels of pedal. Often, just a slight quarter pedal or half pedal will provide the right sonority. In the second theme, the tempo is free to move forward as needed to allow the 16th notes in the left hand to flow. We must follow all of Beethoven's articulations, the two-note slur, two-note portato, one-measure slur, etc. These marks are our musical declamation. At the same time, we must also preserve the ideal of legato and the continuity of the long line. The half-measure and one-measure slurs indicate the musical grouping of the tones, like bowing indications for string players. There should be no musical break between the slurs. Beethoven will use the theme of the brief closing Coda in the development section. We can relax the prevailing pace to close the exposition. Beethoven begins the development by modulating from B-flat to E-flat major using the first motive of the second theme. The sforzandos here should be sonorous, but not too percussive. We hear a beautiful melodic passage in E-flat major with the classic short, short, long phrase pattern immediately repeated and embellished. This compositional improvisation should sound very natural and spontaneous. Beethoven brings back the music of the Coda in E-flat major, builds tension shifting to C minor, and moves back to the tonic G minor. Let the tempo move forward here. Keep the intensity throughout the 10-measure transition that brings us to the recapitulation. The return of the first theme through the rising chromatic line is pure Beethoven genius. Retard the tempo to tempo 1. In the solo sonatas, Beethoven almost always introduces new ideas in the recapitulation. Here, the first theme is in the left hand, beginning in measure 72. The sforzandos should be expressive rather than loud or percussive. Notice the dolce in measure 80 as Beethoven casts the second theme in G minor. Begin this longer section from a very inward point to allow for much greater potential for building tension. The music of greatest intensity and passion, as Rachmaninoff might say, the point of the movement, is measures 85 to 96, specifically measure 92, where we must feel the emotional power of the widely spaced sforzandos. Stretch the timing here, but don't slow the overall tempo down too much. The coda, as in most of the Beethoven piano sonatas, is never a mere ending. Beethoven made the coda a much more powerful and important part of the formal structure. This coda brings the second theme into the deep bass and gives the downbeat eighth note much more emotional weight and emphasis with the three expressive sforzando accents. In the last 8 measures, Beethoven brings a feeling of acceptance or reconciliation to the music by changing the mode to major, beginning with the B natural in measure 105 and staying in G major to the last chord. The sixths and the tenor register create an almost Brahmsian richness to the coda. We should give this coda breadth and depth to create a sense of emotional completion and finality. The mode change at the end of the first movement also prepares us brilliantly for the G major beginning of the Rondo, the second and final movement of this two-movement work. We can pause briefly between the movements. In this movement, we set a tempo giusto in a dotted quarter note pulse, conducted in 2 beats per measure. We should follow the articulation marks exactly, play the grace note gesture before the beat with real attitude and energy. We hear a short but very powerful transition to the B section of the Rondo. These 4 measures change key to G minor immediately and change the character of music radically. Now we hear something very Italian sounding, a tarantella, or maybe a pirate dance. Play with real vigor. For the 16th note accompaniment, keep the left hand relaxed and use a slight rotation. Do not hold any notes. The transition in measures 30 to 32 takes us to the Rondo C section in B flat major, marked dolce. Combine the shorter phrases into a 4-bar longer unit. The right-hand tone should be warm. Keep the left-hand accompaniment very light and rhythmically precise. The C section comes with its own charming interlude. Suddenly, we hear the transition that introduces the B section. Beethoven now goes back, retrograding the sections, and we now hear the B section before the A section. Following the C section in G major, Beethoven really begins to play with the music. We hear the beginning of the A section, but immediately changes it. Beethoven tosses the theme from right hand to left hand, changing the dynamics radically as he does so. Pause to keep us in suspense. And a beautiful lyrical transition brings us to the Coda. Seems like a fade out, but right at the end, Beethoven has one more surprise for us. The tempo, character, and themes in this movement are very similar to, and excellent preparation for, the last movement of the B-flat Piano Concerto, Opus 19. There's a wonderful part in the Concerto that reminds me of the music that we just heard, that pirate dance. Here's the section from the Concerto. And in the Concerto, there's a part that's very, very much like the little interlude that we said was in the Sonata. The Concerto This movement is a great example of Beethoven in scherzando mode. We should have fun as well.